No mai, haere mai, kia ora. I'm Tim. Welcome to our conversation today with Tony and Peter on the future of agritech and food technology. You're joining us coming from, I'm in Christchurch, New Zealand, and Peter is in Palmerston North in the North Island of New Zealand. And Tony, where are you?
I'm in Christchurch on the South Island of New Zealand, the beautiful part of the South Island.
Fantastic. So today we are really looking at this big question of meeting the demand of 70% more food by 2050. And Tony and Peter both bring with them a unique set of experiences and expertise to contribute to this conversation. Again, for those of you that are joining us, do make sure that you get active in the YouTube channel. We want to see your questions and thoughts and conversation because it's a really nice way to complement what we're talking about over the next hour. So, Peter, we'll start with you. Would you give us just a quick introduction of who you are and what you're most excited about around this topic area?
Yes, so thank you very much, Tim. My name is Peter Renhilton, as Tim's described. I'm Executive Director of Agritech New Zealand, and we're an organisation that represents a cross-section of companies and agencies that focus on developing agritech solutions, really designed to meet some of the challenges that we'll be talking about over the next 60 minutes. And what excites me, I think, most is just that very big challenge. How do we feed 10 billion mouths by 2050, given all the uncertainties around things like climate change and water and changing land use? It's a hugely important area, and one that I'm really looking forward to share with the audience over the next hour.
Fantastic, Peter. It is definitely an exciting one, and that number 10 billion really brings it home for me. 70% gets a little bit lost, but 10 billion, my goodness, that's a lot of mouths to feed. Tony.
Hi there, I'm Tony Laming. I'm Chief Executive of Blink Innovation. So we're a agri-business innovation hub, and we are focused on those really big challenges. And what I find really exciting about this space is that in the agri-food industry, we've got big, complex issues. And to solve them, we've got to bring together a whole range of industries and capability. So it's no longer just that farmers can solve it. We need tech, we need biotech, we need environmentalists, we need people who are passionate about water, about nutrients, because they're complex, they're systems, they interact. And if you really want to put your mind to something and make a difference in the world, this is the place to be working at the moment.
I feel like, Tony, we could say that about every single panel discussion topic area that we've covered, is that this is the one to focus on. It's really exciting, and this conversation is definitely one that's been hotly anticipated. Perhaps, Peter, you could start by just framing up the conversation for us and the problems that we have to solve.
No, absolutely, and I think there are one or two slides which we might be able to share to really talk through some of those challenges. So perhaps if I could ask Carl. If
they're up there now, Peter. They are up there.
Ah, cool. Okay, so I'm working on the basis then of not quite seeing them, but the first real slide is around, how do we meet that basic challenge of 10 billion mouths? I mean, the reality is that's going to require a significant increase in food production, but the challenges are there is actually no more land available. That we can't create new land, and so we need to think potentially of new means of food production. In addition, I mean, if we're talking about increasing food production by adding more inputs such as fertilizers and agrochemicals to our land, is that the answer? Well, in New Zealand, the answer is no. We just need to farm smarter. And so one option, and this is really just to set this scene, is one option is to increase the impact of digital farming, i.e. Internet of Things, sensors, drones, etc. These generate the data in which smarter farming decisions can be made. However, how can we translate this into some developing countries where there may be no rural broadband or internet connectivities? These devices won't work. And so technologies that might be developed in countries like New Zealand and the Australia and the USA and Israel might work well in countries where there is a strong rural set of connectivity. But in developing countries, that might not apply. So we actually possibly need to redefine then the phrase of what is nutritious food and what will this look like in 2050? And that's a question I'd like to pose to the audience. You know, what do you think nutritious food will actually look like in 2050?
It's interesting, Peter, that we had a conversation in the climate change panel around one of the big contributors to climate change is the inefficiency around our food production and the way that we sustain ourselves, which also related to the space conversation around how space forces us to really focus on being more efficient, both in the way that we produce nutritious food, what is nutritious food, and how we deal with the waste. And I feel like all those conversations are relevant to what we're about to discuss.
I would absolutely agree with you, Tim. And just taking up to those points, the space discussion, but next year, the New Zealand Space Challenge that takes place between March and October, its core theme is going to be sustainable farming. How can satellites and UAVs support and help sustainable farming? So that's going to be the core theme of next year's New Zealand Space Challenge. And it'll be really interesting just to see how, you know, what the outcome of that particular challenge is. But you see, we're talking here only at this stage about increasing the volume of food production. The other side of the coin is we also need to look at how we can reduce food waste at both the producer, supply chain, and consumer level. I think that's also important. And I'll just give you one example. Last month, I was in the United States and visited a watermelon farm in Central Valley, Northern California. This was a 4,000 hectare farm producing watermelons. 30% of the watermelons weren't picked. They were left on the ground. 30% were damaged as they went from farm to supermarket, which meant that only 40% of the produce actually reached the consumer. So that vast amounts of food waste. And I think there are some people who are saying we actually produce enough food today to feed 10 billion mouths. It's just that so much is lost in the system or consumers physically throw away that we have this potential shortage. So I think food waste is almost as important as to how to tackle that as simply producing more food.
It's fascinating. It's really it really strikes a chord with me that we've potentially already solved the problem, or at least we have the capability to feed the 10 billion mouths, but because of our, I guess, our own errors and inefficiencies in the way we process the food that we produce, we find ourselves having to solve the problem all over again.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's particularly acute in the developed world, where consumers tend to throw away a lot of food. And we know that happens in New Zealand. We know it happens in all major developed countries. The amount of food that is actually just put into dustbins is contributes to this potential long-term shortage. But I want to change the tack slightly here and cover something you mentioned before around climate change.
Fantastic.
Because I think climate change is also incredibly important. And again, there is a two-way discussion here. The argument that you raised, Tim, that agricultural production itself is speeding up climate change is debatable, but I suspect is partly true. And that comes from livestock emissions, from some emissions from different types of plants and nutrients, etc. But we have to accept that climate change is real and it's happening today. And in some regions of the world, including large parts of the developed world, agriculture is likely, output is likely to fail, or fall rather, particularly in areas such as Africa and parts of Asia, where as the world heats up, land will no longer be suitable for current agricultural production. And we're finding even in New Zealand, the long-term impact of climate change means that established centres for the production of kiwi fruit and avocado, for instance, in the Bay of Plenty, may have to shift as the climate in that region gets warmer and warmer. It may simply no longer be suitable for that type of crop. And so it's not simply a case of land not being able to necessarily produce food. It's the fact that the crop types themselves may have to change depending on what the climate offers. And the final point on that is that it's very easy with climate change just to focus on temperature. I think we also have to need to be aware of more extreme weather events. And what I'm thinking there is, for instance, again, taking New Zealand as an example, if we get a very heavy frost at the wrong time of the year, we can lose 40% of our avocado crop. And as more extreme weather events take place across the world, there is that danger that whole crops could be wiped out or very significantly diminished, which again poses that challenge if we're expected to produce 70% more produce.
So yeah, this is where we get these interplays of complexity, right? Is that not only are we having to confront problems of the environment as it is today, but with that changing environment, it does change the dynamic of the problem we have to solve. Potentially, we can move on to the next conversation point around a world with less water. What does that look like?
Well, I think that again, that's a fascinating area. And again, water is a potential victim of climate change, but in both ways. We could either have too little or too much. And obviously, where you get too little, then as we know now, just looking across towards Australia, where they're having a very long-term drought, it's having a very significant impact, not just on livestock, but also on some potential crops. And so lack of water creates huge issues. Too much water can also create problems. I mean, if you have massive storms, that can remove all your topsoils and again have almost as detrimental effect as too little. So managing water is incredibly important. And again, we saw some very important lessons last month in California, which is a state that has suffered a severe drought for a number of years, how they manage their water supply to ensure that farmers can continue to grow crops. But it's not just the amount of water, it's also the quality of water. And I think that is also a big issue. Certainly in New Zealand, quality of water is important so far as consumers are concerned. And there is currently a big debate taking place as to whether intensive farming is impacting on water quality. I have previously lived in India, so I absolutely understand in India the impact of poor quality water. And that's, again, something that we just need to address, not just from the point of view of agricultural production, but also from human consumption. Quality of water is as important as the quantity of it.
One final point instead of framing, and we've touched on some of this, Peter, is what about the environment? We talked about climate change, but can you elaborate further?
Yeah, so I guess this really, the question I got here is how do we increase food production in a world where rapidly changing climate, water quality, etc., is impacting on the way that we farm? How can we save and support the environment so that our children and grandchildren can inherit an earth that is no worse off than the one in which we live? And one of the challenges is that we don't totally know what is going to happen over the next 30 years. And that to me is the big challenge to the young people really on this call. It's the big question that's being posed in terms of what role can they play in trying to help solve these problems. Because only over time, as the situation evolves, will we know what those challenges really are. And for someone like myself, who's probably getting towards the end of their working life, it will be something I will enjoy sitting down and reading about. But the young people on this webinar, it will be for them front, center, and real. Just how do we manage to maintain agricultural production without damaging the environment in very, very unsustainable ways?
Well, It's a really exciting kind of challenge to throw down to our participants, Peter. And Tony, you've been waiting to join the conversation, and I wonder whether you'd like to respond to Peter's challenge around some of the ways the participants can start to think about this next 30 years and overcoming the challenges that Peter has described.
Cool, thanks, Tim. I think I'm going to jump straight to us thinking of this, framing the context of this discussion around farming and food systems are complex. And if we think about starting up a tech company, the environment that we're working in, particularly in e-commerce, is relatively simple. When we look at bringing some new farming systems that employ ranges of different technology in them, we're actually having to look quite often at farming systems that are really old and have been done not for 10 years, but sometimes 100 years. And what we're seeing, and this is a really complex system to get in because it's so fragmented. So when we think about how do we bring the solutions to that and start to work with that, one of the key things we're seeing around the world is the need to actually have our farmers and our growers at the center of this innovation. And so very recently in California, there was a big innovation event where the tech industry was invited by the farmers to actually see how they work. They got to go and pick grapes. They got to go and trim the vines. They got to go and see how food was picked. And then how do you think about the robotic solutions for that? Because robots don't like rain. They don't like wind. They don't like dust storms. So when we talk about automation for this sector, it's not, and the automation we've got so far is things going to robots. And where robots are going to things, it's in a very contained, safe environment. We have to be able to think about, we instinctively look at fruit and know whether it's ripe or not through our touch and our sight. So how do I know that the different colors of red on an apple mean it needs to be picked? And when
Tony, sorry to interrupt, but I'd like to ask a question. Is there an underlying assumption that automation means we're being more efficient, and therefore automation means that we've got a chance to reduce the waste in the way that the waste in the food production cycle? Is that why smart tech and science is seen as the leader in how we actually solve this problem?
It's a good question, Tim. I think there's two parts to it. Absolutely, there's an opportunity on the waste side. And like, how do we reduce the waste by being more efficient? But there's a second part, is that labor is becoming incredibly expensive and less people want to work out in the sunshine and bending over. Mm-hmm. And so to pick our food, and we're having to really think about what those new farming and food systems are. So are we going to be growing things in a field, or how do we start to see more vertical farming and urban farming to produce some of these foods? So completely new business models that have different levels of automation in them because it's become affordable. So you think about lights and growing things under lights now, and not having all the soil that you need, so they're not wasting water and not putting effluent into rivers, because you're actually controlling it and recycling what's used in an environment. So complex, heaps of opportunity, lots of different ways to think about it. So an enormous space for innovation.
It's really exciting. I guess our challenge is always going to be around limiting our conversation on where we explore. But a couple of questions coming in from our participants is just one quite a simple one to ask, but hard one to answer perhaps, is how do we manage waste better? How do we are there examples of smart technology that is actually targeting the management of waste?
Yeah, so there's a great example at the moment in fruit packing. So if we think about a packing line to pack fruit, and people are handling things all the time, and so fruit is getting damaged and pushed off, versus putting that through a machine system with very good robotics that pack things neatly and tidily and don't damage food, and it gets through the system. So just reducing the waste in a part of the system is valuable as well.
Fantastic.
So yeah.
Peter, do you have anything to contribute to, I guess, the use of technology and starting to solve this problem?
Yeah, in terms of, well, directly in terms of waste, I mean, I think there are various things. I think one of the things we need to also understand is how we store food. I mean, when the consumer buys food from the supermarket, they think they can store it in their fridge or their pantry for for any amount of time. They have to realize that very often that food has been sitting in a cold store or a cool store that the supermarket manages for maybe 6 months. And so whilst it looks fresh on the shelf in the supermarket, it actually only has 3 or 4 days life in it once you take it out of that environment and take it home. And I've certainly personally experienced buying food from a supermarket and realized after 3 or 4 days, the only place it's destined for is not the oven, but for the waste bin. And that's simply because I probably buy too much. And again, I think this is possibly managing consumer behavior. The amount of food that is actually just physically taken to dustbins by households is a very significant sum. So it's not just technology; it's also human behavior. I think that's a really important part of education.
Totally, Peter. I was reflecting in the climate change conversation just around a small thing that I have done. Is I now all my main meals come from a small shared kitchen. This kitchen takes orders from households and only prepares enough food to produce the meals that I need for the week. And what I've noticed is that the waste that is going into my waste bin has reduced significantly. Not only is the waste going down, but my expenses have gone down. And I feel that in a very small way, I'm contributing to the reduction of waste. And to the point that we were making in the previous panel is that this is essentially a non-technical solution to a seemingly complex problem. It's a behavioral change solution rather than a really smart technical. And I think for participants, this is the opportunity. There's multiple ways to think about solving these challenges. But potentially we could move on to the next question or discussion point, which is this idea of cross-industry partnerships. And you've both touched on this, is the importance of diverse thinking around the table. Can you think of any examples around this diverse thinking and cross-industry and why it's so important to solving these complex challenges?
Well, perhaps if I just pick that one up first. Basically, Agritech New Zealand, our own organisation, we work very closely with other tech communities focusing on things like Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, blockchain, and all those enabling technologies are significant for agritech. So, agritech cannot be seen as being a kind of standalone technology. Agritech is going to be driven very much by that convergence of other enabling technologies. And I think that's, again, one of the really important things for listeners to this particular broadcast to understand. There are opportunities for a wide range of different technical skills and technology areas to be engaged in to complement work around agritech. And I think that also just picks up on Tony's comments before about the importance of robotics and automation. They require immense amounts of skill in very, very complex environments.
Tony, does anything come to mind for you?
Yeah, I think one of the things we are living with a bit at the moment is that many of our industry structures are quite vertical, whereas the challenges are complex, so they require us to work horizontally. So that's difficult. And not just across an industry where somebody's an expert in water or somebody's an expert in plant genetics or somebody's an expert in technologies, but actually cross industries. And so we're starting to see those collaborations come together and people learning to work in different ways. And particularly now with our millennials coming through, that's a more normal way to work. So that's really starting to boost that way of working.
Just a question: is there anything about our business structures that restrict us from that more horizontal approach to problem solving from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's, it's a great question. And I think it's why we're seeing so much business model innovation is that old legacy incumbents, it's tough to change. Mm. That's the reality of life. It's, as Peter talked earlier, it's about people and behavior. And so creating some of those different structures outside of existing structures that allow those teams to come together without those big incumbents around is where we're seeing that innovation happen on the edge. But
can you point to any New Zealand examples of I guess companies that are on the bleeding edge?
There's a range. Peter, you want to kick off?
Yeah, no, there are a number, and just picking up on what Tony was saying there, most of the disruptive technologies that I'm aware of are not coming out of our kind of traditional major corporates. They are coming out of those younger, much more agile startups, and we've got some great examples in New Zealand. One which we're both very familiar with is one based up in the Bay of Plenty called Robotics Plus. And Robotics Plus have developed a robotic platform which is really focused very much around the kiwi fruit sector. But this doesn't just look at harvesting kiwi fruit, i.e. picking them. It also looks at pollinating the flowers at the beginning of the season. And so there are multiple applications that can sit on that robotic platform. And again, going back to what Tony was saying earlier on in terms of the challenges of labor, and those aren't just a New Zealand challenge around picking seasons, apples in Hawke's Bay, kiwi fruits in the Bay of Plenty. These are global challenges and ones that really impacts farmers across the world. So that drive towards more automation is real, and there are a number of early stage companies in New Zealand really operating well in that space.
One company that I'm aware of is a company called Halter that has got a smart collar that goes on a cow. And what I've read is that this collar allows the farmer to remote control the cow and drive the herd in a particular direction. Is that correct?
It is correct. Yes, it is correct. And in theory, when Halter is applied, you don't actually need to have real fencing around your boundaries because the collar will make sure that the cows or whatever the livestock wearing that collar won't go beyond their boundary. So it's managed by some interesting technology, including GPS. So those are exactly the types of quite disruptive technologies that are emerging in New Zealand.
Just the question is take that Halter technology and bring it back to this question that we're trying to tackle: is what is that link between a smart collar and helping us feed more people?
Oh, so I think if you look at something like the meat industry, which is where this is being developed, is we're very concerned about the environmental footprint animals are creating, that they're getting into the riverways. So that allows us to control that, look after their welfare and detect really quickly if those animals are well, and make sure that they're being cared for appropriately with some of the smart technology that's available. So it starts to deal with some of the bigger questions people have around what they eat as well, and where those animals are and where you want them.
One story that was told in our climate change discussion was around roving herds of cattle in Africa and the destruction that they can bring to local communities and the environment. And it strikes me that the application of a Halter smart collar would be a perfect way of solving this in the African context.
The only question I would have, Tim, is how would you apply collars to roving antelope in going across the but perhaps Tony, who I think originates from that part of the world, might have a better explanation as to how you would apply such collars to those roving animals.
Yeah, so those animals more and more are being tagged. and are being managed in environments. But it does allow us to, if I think about in a New Zealand context, our kaitiakitanga is really important to us, and that, for the overseas people, that's around our guardianship of our environment and of our world for future generations, so for our grandchildren, and that's embedded in our culture. And so some of these really allow us to start to manage some things that we potentially prohibitive because of the cost. So if you think about Africa, building fences is really expensive, particularly in big, extensive farming that's not intensive because the spaces are much bigger. We know that Africa's got huge adoption of mobile technology. It's just skipped a whole range of technology. So suddenly some of these first world can be applied into environments that are really precious and can be managed. And those communities, if you think about the value of food on those in those rural communities for feeding people, can be protected because animals just will go straight for the food. Fencing it off is difficult. So a whole range of opportunities there.
It's fantastic. Now, you've wonderfully segued us into our next discussion point, and potentially you can define this Māori term for our participants, kaitiakitanga. What does that mean to you, Tony?
So what that means for me is that we really have a role as a custodian and a guardian. We're here during our life to look after the resources that are here and ensure that when we hand them on, they're in a better state today than they were when we got them. And that's at the heart of Māoridom, and really precious in a world, well, in a country that, our resources are precious too. And we're seeing that be integrated through all our conversations in agriculture and around our environment and around food. How do we do that? How do we think about the biodiversity in the land as well? So we keep the complexity and we don't destroy precious heritage, whether it's fauna and flora. And so that conversation is opening up innovation in quite a different way by actually listening to the people that have been guardians of the land for a long time. And our Maori people don't sell land. They look at how they can use that land for their people to be productive. And so they think about it differently as well. And sometimes that means leaving the land to the environment and not having anything on it versus and then looking at the kind of growing systems that need to be in there. So a good example would be some dairy farms that are being run by one of the big Maori tribes, which we call iwi. When they've converted to big centre pivots, they've been planting 2,000 indigenous plants around them. And that's been to create bird flight paths from the mountains to the sea that we've destroyed over time through agriculture as we've gone into getting rid of forests and getting rid of natural areas. So they're starting to put those back. And that's a real long-term investment. We won't see some of that actually at its maturity for 30 years. And that's what this concept is about. It is long-term, it's not short-term, and it's not immediate, and it's investing with those long 100-year, 300-year horizons.
Which is, I suppose, in our modern era, kind of a foreign concept for us. We're so short-term in our thinking today because of some of the consumer cycles and various other, I suppose, patterns that we now live by. That the opportunity for participants to start to look, we use the word kaitiakitanga and perhaps not a cultural reference, but really what that means is it's a more holistic approach, thinking about your overall impact and how you want to leave the resource, consume the resource and leave the resource, so you're not stealing away from the future. Is that a nice way to summarize it?
Great way.
Okay. Well, look, let's keep moving. There's a question from the audience, and this one's really trying to get right to the punch. Is what is one of the challenges that you both see as being the most vital that we need to solve? Like, if you could go and work on one challenge, what would it be?
If I can perhaps answer that question first, and this actually kind of reverses the tech issue. It's less the technology, it's more the adoption of that technology. And one of the great challenges I think we have is actually not just coming up with new, great, innovative ideas. It's actually working with farmers and growers for them to actually adopt and adapt those ideas. And again, just to put this into context, in New Zealand and many developed worlds, the average age of farmers is now kind of 58, 59 years old. And so it's going to be that new generation of people, the kind of people listening to this webcast, that will come in and will be possibly more amenable to some of the new technologies and new ways of thinking. And I think that is, again, one of the challenges that a lot of technology companies have. It's actually how do we encourage the farming community themselves to adapt some of these new technologies and innovations to not just improve production, but also be much more sustainable in the way that they farm.
It's really interesting, Peter, because Charles, from our previous climate change discussion, made this observation too, is that one of the big challenges to overcoming the climate change challenge and adapting to it is simply we are living, in some cases, with 100-year-old technology and the inefficiencies that that technology produces. Whereas if we could simply accelerate the adoption of the knowledge and the technology that we know is more efficient, that would go a long way to actually solving the problem. Like, we actually have a lot of the answers today. It's just how do we get them out there? How do we get people to adopt them?
And I think that is the challenge. So part of that is education, and part of that is working with farmers' trusted advisors. In my experience, and I'm sitting right now in Palmerston North. I was out with some dairy farming friends last night, and I mean their most trusted advisors are their neighbours. And if their neighbours adapt new technology, a new innovation, and it seems to work, then they will follow. But there are only a relatively small number of people who are prepared to take that first leap of faith. So I think it's about education and just working with farmers and growers to demonstrate to them that these new technologies and these new business models can work.
One company that you and I spoke about, Peter, was I think it's the Climate Organization out of America, and just their story around using data and the data to drive an insurance product. But what they found is that farmers, through the insight they were gaining from having to provide data to get better premiums on their insurance, they started finding out actually there are more efficient ways of doing the farming practice. Can you elaborate or tell that story a little bit more clearly?
Well, certainly I can certainly say a little bit about Climate Corp, based in the US. I mean, Climate Corp collects a lot of data, and for people who aren't familiar with farming, that is actually one of the most important moves currently taking place around the whole concept of digital farming. So if I was to be asked, what does the farm of the future look like, say 10, 20 years from now? A lot of today's operational aspects will be managed in a much more digital way. That means on farm, there'll be more use of drones, there'll be in-ground sensors, there will be more automation, and all those digital devices will be supplying a very, very significant amount of data. And what's going to be interesting in the future is to see how we can aggregate that data, and then from that data, make recommendations to the farmer about what that farmer needs to do to, for instance, where on a farm does it need to apply fertilizer or apply pesticide? Because right now what happens is if fertilizer is applied to a field, it tends to just get applied to the entire field. And yet perhaps only 15% of it actually requires fertilizer. And so there are huge amounts of inputs being applied to the ground that aren't necessary. And it's those inputs that then run off into rivers and cause a lot of the environmental damage. Yeah. So my concept of the future is that farm of the future will be far smarter, and the farmer will have access to data, which at the moment they simply don't have.
Which is a great, I guess, segue to it. One of the observations that one of our participants has raised, which is in their country, the perception is that being a farmer equates to a low-income lifestyle. And actually, what I'm hearing is that the farmer of the future is actually the technologist, They're going to be leading the charge with using data, technology, the internet, connecting with people around the world to do farming more efficiently. Is that true?
Absolutely, and I think today, if we look at farmers, the top farmers around the world are multi-dimensional business people. They are leading environmentalists. They are biosecurity experts, and they're having to learn and adopt technology really fast. And so we're seeing this divide start to come through with very capable business people and innovators that need to be adapting and thinking all the time, versus the labor element. And so farming and agriculture is traditionally not paid very well. So the challenge for the sector is how it really attracts that capability to drive this innovation, but also pays properly for what is needed going forward. And we're seeing that come. We absolutely see that in the top 20% of farmers.
One observation I have is that when our participants perhaps look around to their local communities where labour costs are potentially a lot lower than what we face in the developed world, what is the pathway to, just like I think one of you mentioned in Africa, we've jumped over some of the infrastructure development milestones. Is there a way for people to help farmers of today jump over some of those developmental steps and say, actually, I'm going to be a farmer of the future in a week or a month or a year? What does that journey look like?
So I think there's some real opportunities for communities. The ability to help communities produce more food with what they've got, through bringing those small little farmers together in some collectives, and being able to use some of this technology around how much nutrient do you put in, how much water you really need, and part of that education that we see to actually literally double and triple output. And that changes that community's prosperity by doing that. So there's an ability to bring some of these platforms into communities. Where, labour is not only a developed world issue. We're seeing huge amounts of waste of food in India that's just not being picked because people don't want to do it anymore. Young people are going into the cities to work. So it's how do we start to rethink some of those collective social models to improve prosperity overall.
Interesting. So the problem scenario that we've got up on the slides is really talking to this, Tony, is, what are those incentives that we can use to drive change in land use to solve this problem. And you've talked about the idea of collectives and pooling of resources to potentially begin to purchase some of these innovative technologies. Can you think of other incentives that will change land use?
So I think the other big incentive is an awareness of lessening the impact that we're having on the land and caring for it more than we've come through an industrial age where we've been very consumer and capitalist driven. I think we're seeing that swing back the other way. And so the incentives are, as we talked earlier, around a more holistic approach and leaving a world that we want our children and our grandchildren to live in. And that social cohesion and social contribution is becoming, and having a purpose in what we do is becoming a big part of how new business models are being put together and how innovation is being thought about. And it's those that are really starting to create innovation in the world as well.
What again, an observation for me is how do you break the cycle of a farmer? And Peter, you talked about this around some of the financial model innovation that needs to go on to help a farmer break out of the cycle that they are trapped in.
Yeah, and so I'm going to go, if I may, Tim, just back to the point of the kind of farmer in the developing world that has a very small holding. I absolutely agree with what Tony was saying, but very often those farmers are very subject to market price changes over which they've got very, very little control. And certainly discussions I've been having recently with agencies in China suggest that one of the problems of a lot of small farmers there is that they have virtually no control on market pricing. Access to distribution networks for them is very challenging. There isn't the right infrastructure. So that's where you do need to get communities to work together, because the individual farmer can't address those issues by him or herself. In terms of pricing generally, though, in terms of financial models, really interesting. And I'm going to, again, just an example in New Zealand. In New Zealand, if you look at our dairy sector, you might find that the average size of herd, i.e. number of cows, maybe say 400, 450. Even if you go into the United States, up into the northeast of the United States, the average herd size in pastoral farming is possibly only 65 or 70. And so those farmers simply don't have the capital to invest in a lot of the technology that might be needed to actually improve production in different ways. So access to capital is really quite important. Again, a recent conversation I had with a big US agribusiness was around developing risk management plans which would help them understand farmers' access to credit.
Right.
So even in some of the larger US farms, the margins they're working to are very small. And so getting the financial model right is really important, not just for that small farmer, but also for larger established farm networks.
Which is interesting, because it's a shared challenge, is having access to the capital required to break out of the current cycle. And are there any examples of potentially, small loans or funds available to that small farmer or that community collective that's trying to just go from one level to the next? Is that being done by anyone?
There's a range of different microfinancing structures that are particularly operating through Asia and through Africa. And on some of those, they're seeing, 18 months return on those. And we're seeing some of that microfinancing now starting to move into telco companies, where small farmers and small traders are turning money very, very fast. So breaking some of the traditional finance sector structures by just looking at how money is used in a different way, because those cash economies really struggle to get hold of credit. So there's a whole lot of disruption happening in those markets as people are looking to step up. So it's not our traditional financing that we're used to.
Yeah, interesting. And I wonder, can you point to a specific example in one of those markets of that in motion, so potentially our participants can go and have a look at?
Yeah, so if you look in Africa at MTN and the microfinancing products that they have on the back of your cell phone account. And so if you think about the opportunity cost for a person trading vegetables or fruit in a market, leaving their stand to go and get some money, go and buy some more and come back, versus just being able to continue to trade on their cell phone account. And so if I want an extra $10 and it costs me $1, but actually I got an extra 3 hours of trading, they really get those numbers. Our banking institutions don't understand those numbers.
Right.
And so they're just seeing, hundreds of thousands of transactions going through really, really fast through that environment. And then you look at some of the microfinancing structures under an organization called Vision Fund, which is about establishing and lending money, so $500 and different amounts to people wanting to go the next step with their business. And we're seeing really good payback on those as well.
So this is, again, a nice little segue that even for a financier that's studying finance or business models, there's a way to find your place at that multidisciplinary table. And to our participants out there, is that it's really tapping into each of your own skill sets and backgrounds and capabilities, and thinking about how you can contribute to solving one of these problems. And what our experts have laid on for us is such a range of examples of angles or perspectives to enter into this problem space. We're coming to the end of the time we have together. I wonder, and again, participants, please feel free to ask questions as we go. But whilst we're waiting for some of those to come through, potentially, Peter and Tony, I'm going to ask you just one thing, that if you had 10 days, like our participants do, what would you be working on? You know, what would you be challenging yourself to do within 10 days with a diverse team from around the world? What would you choose to work on?
Well, I'll answer the question first, without having had any briefing that this question was going to be asked. I would really want to focus on one thing, because I think it's very easy, as Tony has been saying quite correctly, this is a very, very complex area. And if you try and manage a very major problem in 10 days, it's going to be pretty tough, even for those of us who've been around for a little while. So I think you really need to identify one specific area. And what I would do is suggest is identify a farmer's problem. So before you sit around the table, make sure that you've spoken to some farmers or to some growers to find out what are their core immediate problems, and then just focus around one of those. One of the problems I find sometimes with technology companies is they come up with the solution and then take it to the farmer, and then the farmer will say, well, that's not actually our major problem. So you really need to identify what the farmer's problem is first, focus on that, and then work around that over your 10-day period.
Fantastic, Peter. And it plays participants really well into the work ahead around this human-centered approach to problem solving, which is developing empathy with your target customer. And one observation that I would make is there are no shortage of problems, and your challenge is going to be overcoming that sense of the problem I'm working on is not big enough, it's not good enough. It's the one that makes you excited and drives your passion, and that's the problem that you need to be going and working on. But as Peter has said, you need to make sure, checking in with those farmers, that actually is the problem that they've got, because my goodness, it will be a lot easier to make traction and build some momentum if it's a genuine problem. Tony, have you got any insight from your perspective?
So building on Peter's one, because I absolutely think unless we're dealing with the real problems, we're wasting time. And so it has to come from the people. The one for me really is this ability for farmers to be able to share their insights. So Peter talked earlier about, I trust my neighbour and what they do. As we move into land use change, farmers are saying, who else is doing this? What results are they getting? How do I know if I change my land from one thing to another? And farmers don't change everything in one go. It gets done in steps to manage the risk. And remember, most farmers only have 40 growing cycles in their life, 40 years. One shot. If we mess it up, there's no money that year. So what we're hearing people say is, I want to know who else is doing this. So really understanding those questions and finding a way to connect those farmers to share that information and de-risk some of those decisions and that change, which will hopefully help adoption and yeah.
Fantastic. Peter and Tony, you've been absolutely marvellous. I feel like we've been able to cover such breadth of conversation and really provide some tangible examples for our participants to get their minds spinning and hopefully land somewhere. And you've also provided a nice construct for them to genuinely make some progress over the next 10 days. So on behalf of us at the Emerging Future Summit, thanks so much to you participants. Thanks for attending. We really look forward to joining with you again tomorrow at 4 o'clock New Zealand time, where we'll be starting to look at waste streams and the circular economy. And there is absolutely no doubt that there will be conversations from this panel that will be relevant to tomorrow. So thanks again. Kia ora.